If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Lore by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we shall review Wraith the Oblivion 20th Anniversary Edition, as I present my thoughts and opinions on its presentation and mechanics to help you better decide whether this is the game for you. This is the sound of a hardback book consisting of 512 pages hitting a concerningly fragile fold-up desk. This book is Wraith the Oblivion 20th Anniversary Edition, the first World of Darkness game I purchased after Vampire the Masquerade rather than Werewolf or Mage, the other two big and arguably more popular games than Wraith ever was. The purchase came about roughly at the end of June 2020, when I was trying to run a V20 Dark Ages actual play with and for some friends. One player wanted to be a Giovanni, lost in the British Isles, but really wanted to incorporate Wraith the Oblivion lore with their character. At the time, I knew nothing about Wraith other than it existed, and according to a brief conversation I had with the Gentleman Gamer, it didn't always have to be all doom and gloom, but could be a game of hope. In any case, I would purchase the book and show it off to the world the day it landed on my lap, the 6th of July, 2020. Whilst that Dark Ages game never saw the light of day, I've still managed to make plenty of good use out of that big spoopy boy, mainly in the form of the Lore by Night podcast, helping felling vampiric necromancers everywhere. As of the writing of this script, I have covered most Wraith the Oblivion lore on the podcast. By this episode has gone live, I would have read and written the remainder of Wraith lore, being the first to cover pretty much the entirety of Wraith the Oblivion in an online manner like this. So it's pretty obvious I'm a fan of the material, but how does it hold up mechanically? Is it not as complicated as others would have you believe? But before we sit back and crack open a cold dead one, here are the rules for the Lore by Night book reviews. I will explore snippets of the lore, mechanics and rules found within the tome. I will look as to how they're presented and easily they're conveyed to new and old players alike. As this is a review written and presented by me, all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I have said, that is totally fine. It does not mean that you are right and I am wrong, and vice versa. As of my previous book reviews, I will start at the very beginning, which is the physical book itself, which currently sits nicely upon my lap. It is a letter-sized hardback book made out of that slightly squishy cardboard material, meaning it will mark easily, most notably across the spine of the book if you use a copy as I do my own. I know this will bother some people, so it may be worth purchasing the PDF copy instead, especially with a tome of this size. It certainly makes it easy to find things, unless you're like me and have Wraith as one of your special interests. The cover of the book uses an imposing chain and lock idea made up of an amalgamation of the legions that make up the hierarchy that rule the Dark Kingdom of Iron, Stygia, otherwise known as the Seal of Stygia. All three editions use this motif, but whereas first and second editions have lighter tones consisting of blues and greys, it is this edition of Wraith that possibly has the most menacing variation of these motifs, with a deep blue, almost black chains with a turquoise lock. It paints the game in a different light, stripping the implied sadness of the previous edition covers, replacing them with an imposing 20-ton depressive weight. You could argue that it also be more sinister, as the chains could be mistaken for some tentacle mass at a glance, hinting at the future of the Wraith canon, the destruction of the underworld through the 6th Great Maelstrom, and the large invasion of Coldheart, Guru, and Spectre hordes. As for the rest of the art direction of this book, this is by far some of the most impressive art that Onyx Path has produced for a World of Darkness book. Many of the pieces come from existing core and source books like many of the John Cobb classics, some with more edits than others, but the original pieces, especially that of Samuel Aria and Mark Kelly, are just fantastic, bringing forth the twisted horrors of Wraith into the 21st century with beautifully horrifying sadness in places. I also have to mention mention just how awesome the map of Stygia is, which dominates the 52nd and 53rd pages of the book, as well as the double-page spreads that announce the 3 sections of the book. There is very little of the artwork in this book that doesn't resonate with me on a profoundly deep level. The only pieces I don't like are the pieces that take up the adjacent left page at the beginning of each chapter, particularly because I'm not a fan of the art style, but they are noticeably pixelated, which really pulled me out of the experience when I first read the book, which is such a shame really. I can only hope that was an issue with my standard drive-through RPG copy only. On the topic of legibility, the chapter headings use this old Gothic style font that, whilst looks cool and appropriately well, Gothic, it might not be the easiest font to read, especially if English is not your first language. A similar font is used for certain Arconi, Wraith powers, towards the end of the book, rather than adopting what happens earlier. Granted, the stylistic font I refer to were done by John Cobb and the names of the guilds, but I don't think it's too far-fetched of an idea for him to do something similar with the non-Western Arconi/Wraiths. Finally, one stylized addition to Wraith by John Cobb that I've always thought was pretty cool was the initials used at the beginning of paragraphs and sections of the book. It is totally unnecessary to have almost every letter of the alphabet illustrated with these horribly great, stretched out faces, but it is little details like this that say rather loudly how much the team cares for the material, wanting to invoke those macabre feelings within the reader, to excite and to engage them, rather than just presenting text on a white page and be done with it, as was the case of a certain upcoming vampire game would later do. Even then, the pages of this Wraith book are not white, but this very faintly icy blue. You could say it's somewhat ghostly. Once you have read the lengthy graphic novel/comic that replaces the short story that is a staple to World of Darkness books and packed contents page, you are greeted with the standard introductory chapter that details what the book aims to cover and what you'll find inside. Here, we are presented with the general themes of Wraith, including what exactly is a Wraith, the underworld, Oblivion, the shadow, the concept of transcendence, as well as the passions and horrors that drive Wraiths forward. Of course, one cannot forget to mention that we also learn that each Wraith has 4 characteristics: insusceptibility, deaf sight, life sight, and sharpened senses, all of which are very interesting themes and should definitely be explored at your own leisure. The chapter also talks about the storytelling system, for anyone who is unfamiliar with it, as well as discussing Wraith's spin on the Storyteller system, all presented with this aura of tragedy and destiny, referring to the Greeks of old. Whilst this may seem like very clever artistic flair, which probably is, it is relevant from a storytelling purpose of the human race, and a not so subtle nod to the origin point of the beginning of the Wraith the Oblivion metaplot. It briefly talks about the previous 2 editions and states there have been some minor changes, or rather updates, as the game is essentially reborn, ignoring the events of the End of Empire, the final Wraith book in the original line that details the Great Sixth Maelstrom. It, like many of the End of Splat books, are not considered canon in the 20th Anniversary Edition line for obvious reasons. The chapter ends with a handy lexicon and source material themes to watch and listen to, so this is ample opportunity to watch your favourite horror films and scare the shit out of your family and say it's for the purpose of research, especially if you're not all too familiar with the genre yourself and want to educate yourself. I will say, as a personal preference, it would have been nice to have some video games included in this list, but I know this is a tall order to ask, as they never do this with World of Darkness books, only with their own Chronicles of Darkness books. If you're curious what horror games I would include here, excluding the Wraith VR game that would later appear, I would throw in the Fatal Frame games, particularly 1 and 3, Amnesia: The Dark Descent, PT, Fear, and, with a bit of experimentation, Silent Hill and System Shock. One thing I will criticise here with what I'm assuming is a misstep is some terms are missing from the lexicon, notably Lemur and Domain, a young Wraith and one devoid of fetters respectively. respectively. Both are used in this book, and neither in the lexicon or later described what they are. Similarly, how first and second editions would break these down. Likewise, a gaunt is not mentioned here either. Not a huge issue, as a quick look on the wiki can fix that, but still an annoying one all the same. The entry from Mitty made me chuckle. Following this is a beefy second chapter, consisting of 68 pages of setting, which is almost a nice amount of material. Jokes aside, 68 pages is a daunting amount of material for anyone to wade through just to understand the material. In all honesty, all that is needed for most games of Wraith are the first 3 pages to understand the concepts of the Shroud and Fog and the sundering connecting these concepts, how the Shadowlands differ from the physical realm, the Skinlands. There are also brief yet informative paragraphs on Oblivion and the Labyrinth, the latter occurring even less in games than Stygia itself. The next nearly 20 pages about the history of the Western Underworld, from Charon's noble days right up to his chasing of Guru into the Sunless Sea at the tail end of the Fifth Great Maelstrom during the Second World War. Whilst I won't go through the specifics of each event, as I have done plenty of podcast episodes doing this already, I will comment that whilst the information is delivered in a concise and engaging way, the absence of a once familiar romanticism found in previous books is a sad departure, but as this book is designed to be an all-in-one tome, plus its size, having the main story of Wraith consisting many pages from the get-go with such poetic poise could have been difficult to digest, particularly if you are a newer fan of the World of Darkness and are already intimidated by such a heavy book. There is one section of this retelling I find a little frustrating, both from a meta-plot and a moral standing. It is stated that Specters influenced the coming of the Great Depression. This to me is an interesting hook. What isn't is the implication that they planted, or rather encouraged, the evil thoughts in Hitler's heads into action, which contradicts the very strong message of charnel houses of Europe that humans caused the likes of the Holocaust, not the supernaturals of the World of Darkness. Whilst I understand the logic behind it, it does not mean I have to like it. Next, we learn about the doings and economics of the Underworld, really driving home the point that the Underworld is a screwed up place where everything is either a relic from beyond the veil or made up of a melted wraith tossed into the soul forges. This also includes money, the oboli, the latter left as rather vague in terms of how to pair that with the resources in character creation, something that earlier books defined, which leaves for the storyteller to come up with some vague transfer rate, providing they don't have the table from the first edition to hand. There is also information on the culture and physics of Wraith, such as the coal that a new Wraith must break from upon arriving in the Shadowlands, as well as their appearance and idealized visage of oneself, tainted by the shadow. It is a variation on both previous editions' descriptions of one's own corpus, which is why I find the most thematically appealing, in the addition to fairly bland yet informative descriptions of death marks and more engaging write-ups on the psyche and shadow, the former taken up by you and the shadow is another player. Naturally, explanations of catharsis and harrowing are provided as well, as both players would go through these together. Drones, thralls and reaping are explained, as is the interesting inclusion of masks, which would come up occasionally in a couple of source books, so it's interesting that it's highlighted here as a thing of importance in Wraith society, especially with the write-ups of the Hakata and Harbingers of Skulls in Law of the Bloodlines and Cult of the Blood Gods respectively. The remainder of the chapter focuses on Stygian society as a whole, which has a lot of information to cover, which we've already looked at in previous episodes of the podcast, so I will try and be brief with you. There is a very broad summarization of the legions, which is more helpful to STs rather than players, presenting as much as the player would need to know, but lacking the nitty-gritty in each of specific legions' culture and their respective death lords, particularly the latter. A general overview of the general culture in the hierarchy and the history of the concept of the guilds and revolts are detailed in probably the easiest to understand format across any Wraith book prior to this one, albeit just as beefy as before. What is almost unique to this book, however, is a very detailed and thorough description of Stygia, its landmarks, and the aforementioned detailed banana-shaped map. I say almost, as the books at End of Empire and The Hierarchy do explore Stygia, but not as detailed here. That said, Stygia is still just as vague and contradictory in its design and layout, which is something I like as an ST, as one can build, add, and take away themes with ease. Of course, anyone can do this, but with this megacity designed in such a way, it adds safety for the newer ST to make the underworld their own. The next 3 chapters concern the basic rules and mechanics of the Storyteller system, which takes up Chapter 3, and character creation, which is the main focus of Chapters 4 and 5. I won't go through over the mechanics too much, given I've already done episodes on character creation, but there are a few things I want to address. Wraith the Oblivion is a very unique game where your character has died. They are not an adventurer seeking their life or a vampire trying to make their unlife, but a ghost that has already lived all of theirs, so a different mindset is needed to try and get players comfortable with embracing death so bluntly, and that portion of Chapter 4 certainly got me further involved with the mindset of portraying ghosts and summarising their life story in a few words, providing you're not the sort of player that has to write a novella every time, which is not a bad thing to do. However, this is one instance where some of that gothic poise and sadness might have been appropriate places, as I felt oddly moved by the character creation chapter in the first edition of Wraith. It wasn't particularly memorable here. This is probably a strange comment to pass, given it's meant to be a character creation chapter, and the only things you need to remember are the parts directly involving your character sheet. The reason why I say this is that the attribute and ability section in Chapter 5 made me audibly laugh on many occasions. Many 20th Anniversary Edition core books, particularly Vampire, were unnecessarily nebulous about the different ranks of each skill, where there is a silly Britishness to it here. Some particular highlights include Level 1 Appearance, you were the before picture in many ads, Level 5 Perception, Needles, Haystacks, Child's Play. Level 5 Talent, you can hear a pin drop and know what type of grenade it is from, and Level 5 Empathy, your psychiatrist told you about his mother. Both the backgrounds and arcani sections of the chapter are particularly confusing to pick out for the new reader, but there is some minor crossover and some of the backgrounds that may confuse people, as they have done with pretty much everyone else I have spoken to about Wraith backgrounds. The Arcani section, however, is initially confusing to understand, as it has been across all 3 editions. First edition handled this in the best in my opinion, by labelling the power as the title, then having a section on the guild in question within said Arcani, which makes it a bit clearer that not every Wraith belongs to the Arcani's associated guild, like a vampire might a clan. This was a particularly hard hurdle for me to get over, given this was the first World of Darkness game I got into after Vampire, but then again, so would many people. I will say that I really do like and appreciate the efforts that Onyx Path made to introduce the concept of guild marks, initiative Arcanos powers, and expand and introduce new lore for the guilds, many of who never got their own guild book. Neither did it receive a lore of the guild's book, which I would love to have in my collection and work on, hint hint, wink wink, nudge nudge. All of these editions are very interesting and put interesting spin on the guilds I wouldn't have otherwise associated with them, mainly the Harbingers. That said, the Usurers' new lore is just as lazy as it is interesting. The destruction of their own records does plant intrigue into potential storylines galore. It would have been more interesting to have a sidebar or a portion saying what exactly they disposed of. A small gripe, but a gripe nonetheless. Chapter 6 is the chapter that is dedicated to all things relating to the Shadow, the nasty little devil on your shoulder to beckon you to all those nasty things and much, much more. It begins with the character creation portion, brilliantly walking through the player how to assemble the right shadow for the player in question, as well as handy tips in portraying it. The Shadow, much like the Wraith proper, the Psyche, is a peculiar mindset to get into, as when you understand it, Wraith becomes a game of consensual gaslighting and understanding when to give and take, applying to your session 0 notes and lines and veils so you can create some truly bastard characters. It is an expertly written portion portion of the book that aided me to feel comfortable with the idea, and even excited me for some shadow play, be it the standard way, or one player being another shadow, one separate player being everyone's shadow, or the ST acting as everyone's shadows, all of which I've encouraged, suggested as alternatives, which I appreciate. The second half of the chapter, or perhaps the latter third of the chapter, is about various harrowings, target and destruction harrowings, the basics of them, and extensive descriptions of what may happen and how to roleplay them, which is ultimately better suited for the storyteller, for they really could be anything, depending on the context. Whilst the section is informative, perhaps too informative at times, the feel of them is lost for me here, something that the first edition explains better, including the shadow archetypes, rather than keeping them general to the point of vague interpretation. The next chapter is the storytelling chapter, which is probably one of my favourite chapters in the book, which will surprise no one who is an avid listener of the podcast and my book reviews. It, like many of the other World of Darkness core books, expands the themes, moods, and settings possible in a Wraith game, filled with plenty of chronicle plot hooks, ideas, and suggestions for circles of all different types, whether you are renegades fighting against the hierarchy or another renegade group, or even Wraiths doing an errand for a ferryman. There are many jumping off points for STs of any experience level to run with. That's not all that it does, because it gives STs advice on how to handle their players' passions and fetters, as well as games ending through the means of character deaths. It ends the chapter with a whole section on responsibility, reminding the reader that this isn't a game for everyone and how to politely handle that, as well as the general care for your players. Chapters 8 and 9 are your crunch chapters, filled with maneuvers both in general to the Storyteller games and Wraith-specific weapons, armors, combat, and much more, which I don't think I need to go over too much. Very mechanic-heavy chapters. What I can talk about is Specters, which is the focus of Chapter 10. It covers creating and role-playing Specters and their relationship to the standard backgrounds you can choose at character creation, in addition to the creation of the psyche for your Shadow-Eaten Wraith. Other than that, there's little I've not said in my review of Dark Reflection Spectre. If you haven't seen my review of that book, I will repeat a section from that review to you. If you have Wraith the Oblivion 20th Anniversary Edition, you technically own this book as well, as large sections have literally been copied and pasted from Dark Reflections and into the big chunky core book, omitting the authors who wrote Dark Reflections. I can't comment on the legalities of that, for I am no expert in the field, but I will agree that most will agree with me when I say that is incredibly disrespectful and lazy. However, I would still recommend that book to players and STs of Wraith the Oblivion. Whereas the 20th Anniversary Edition of Wraith does a superb job at clearly informing the reader what Specters are, how they behave, and more, the tone Dark Reflections Specters sets a far dark and arguably more appropriate tone for the heartless creatures Specters are. It makes for a more engaging yet equally disturbing read to learn about Specters through that short tome than it does through Wraith the Oblivion 20th Anniversary Edition, and it's worth for the purchase for that alone. Similar comments can be said regarding the following chapter, which is about the Risen, though I feel it captures an obsessively determined nature of their goals in life, rather than motivated monsters that were the playfiends of the Puppeters Guild. I was initially more fascinated by the Risen during my first read-through of the book because of said write-up, feeling the cruel sadness of their fate and the arduous journey they must commit themselves to, which all may be in vain, cause the Shadow says fuck you. Chapter 12 is titled The World of Darkness, which starts off with how you would expect, various individuals across all the various splats, both supernatural and fairly mundane, fit with stats, sample powers, etc., which is something that always humoured me, in addition of neonatal elder vampires getting their own suggested Wraith-like stats. What differs here compared to vampires is that you can build your NPCs from scratch using character creation, using appropriate points to distribute how you please. If using the standard suggestions are not to your liking, or you feel overwhelmed with the work for one reason or another. This chapter also includes a little box at the beginning of the chapter that mentions how to deal with mortals that cross over into the underworld, as well as other underworld creatures like the Barghest and Kraken. I'm not kidding, there is a plasmic Kraken chilling in the Tempest, which has been nerfed a considerable amount from its introduction in 2nd edition. The chapter ends with a multitude of relics and artifacts for players to use, be it as a Regulus Wraith or a Spectre. The latter I consider to be more interesting, probably because I am a grubby edgelord at heart. Just kidding. Barely. The penultimate chapter is titled The Other Dark Kingdoms, which is about, well, the other Dark Kingdoms. The Dark Kingdom of Jade, otherwise known as the Yellow Springs. Saga, the City of Delights, which is the Dark Kingdom of India. The Dark Kingdom of Ascidian, consisting of the Americas, excluding the islands of Flint and Gold that have since been destroyed, or have they? There is also the information on the Bush of Ghosts, or the Dark Kingdom of Ivory, which, as you probably guessed, is Africa's portion of the underworld, as well as Carter, the Dark Kingdom of Clay, Australia's underworld, and finally, the Mirrorlands, the Caribbean. As you would expect, each Dark Kingdom has its own culture and relationship between Shadow and Psyche for the most part, usually having their own names, in addition to fetters, passions, and the other core Wraith elements, all of which are very interesting to read and interpret, which is somewhat more sanitized when compared to the original write-ups of said kingdoms in previous editions. For example, the Dark Kingdom of Jade is not so focused on the conquest of the West, removing all the yellow peril racist rhetoric that is so offensive not just in World of Darkness material, but in media in general. The chapter ends with 3 of the kingdoms, Jade, Svarga, and Bush of Ghosts, getting their own set of arcani, updated from the initial inclusions, which offer some interestingly horrifying powers for Wraiths from those various kingdoms. One little gripe I have with this though is that this chapter also suffers that lazy copy and paste dilemma mentioned in the Spectre chapter, only this time it is the Immortal Guard in the Jade section of the chapter, amongst other places of course. The Immortal Guard have a law ability, law as in LAW, which isn't a feature in 20th Anniversary Edition games, but it is mentioned in the Dark Kingdom of Jade sourcebook where the stats come from. The final chapter of the book is actually an additional game that I forgot about until I was reviewing this book, which I guess is Orpheus 20th Anniversary Edition. In case you didn't know, Orpheus was the last original game line to be set in the World of Darkness before it all caved in on itself. It follows a corporation called the Orpheus Group that deals with the dead, following the event of the 6th Great Maelstrom. They've learned and perfected the art of projection, following people who have undergone near-death experiences to leave their bodies and enter the spirit realm, the Shadowlands. The company uses these employees, along with allied ghosts, as agents and contracts them out to clients for investigations into hauntings, fumigating raging spirits, and other spooky tasks. It's not a sequel or spiritual successor as such, but there is plenty of Wraith-related themed STs can throw at their players. Because this is an entirely other game, I don't think it would make sense for me to review this portion of the book here, as it's rather tonally different to the rest of the book and Wraith as a whole, minus the connecting factor of them dealing with ghosts. Ghosts and spirits have always been an obsession of mine. Vampires and ghosts have battled out my supernatural loving brain since the tender age of 3, when my late father dumped me in front of our big, thick TV with one of those old PlayStation 1 demo discs, and I played Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver, which in hindsight was definitely influenced by Wraith, or at least Vampire the Masquerade. It probably kickstarted my love of Tales of Betrayal, the underdog's redemption arc, sadness to drowning, and well-spoken male voice actors that made me question my sexuality. Wraith the Oblivion scratches all those itches, besides the last one obviously. What was first an attempt to make a vampire game feel more alive with a different game line became a headfirst dive into a nihil in what is probably my favourite game world in recent memory. Yes, Wraith is a game about death and loss, but it is so much more than moping about being dead. Wraith very much is a game of hope. Sure, transcendence is a theme, initially presented as something rather small, a way for the soul to move on, but transcendence, in dictionary terms, is to go beyond or above the range of normal or physical human experience. As a ghost, you have already achieved this. As a Wraith, you have the opportunity to be the silent vigilante or crook. You can shape the fate of a whole new world, alien yet similar to our own, as you face and cooperate with your inner demon, contemplating your very existence and learn what keeps you going as you stare at your corporeal reflection. I think it's pretty apparent I love Wraith the Oblivion, and I love this edition of the book. It's a Herculean tome that brings the best of all previous previous material and updates and removes the jank, complicated and vague mechanics to make a fairly tricky game more manageable and just as fun and creative for all playing. It isn't perfect by any means. A certain layout and organisation of chapters and powers make it confusing to navigate and to assemble character. The romantic goth vibes that made the original's brand of horror separate from what came before are tragically absent, as well as the fact that subject matter means one has to tackle traumas we all have in common. That being said, I do encourage everyone to play Wraith at least once at their tables and see what tales you can weave and emotions you can process. Players, ignore most of the book, just learn how to make a character and maybe the second part of chapter 2. The rest is optional fluff for the storyteller, assuming that Stygia even comes up at all. But with the entirety of the human history at your disposal, plus macabre ghostly themes, the world and underworld is indeed your oyster. And for those of you who are new to the Lore by Night brand and the reviews I occasionally do, I do not do out of 10 scores because they are subjectively pointless. One person's 10 out of 10 is another's 3 out of 5 stars, whilst another's is minus 42 out of 100, so I shall rate this book Driving Factor out of 10, as that is just as helpful as a proper out of 10 score. To be kept updated, follow the Lore by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, and you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.